I'm Ross Fairley. I'm a partner in the law firm Burgess Salmon. The slide here says come and see us because we've got a big stand here. And on that stand is all sorts of reports and interesting stuff that we've done in this sector, so do come and see us. Burgess Salmon is interested in this area because our two biggest sectors in which we operate are transport and energy, and particularly renewable energy. And I do come from the renewable energy side as opposed to the pure transport side, so I probably provide a slightly different perspective to many of the speakers in this conference today. So earlier this year, we sponsored and contributed to a report by Regen, which is available on our stand. And this looked at the blockers and enablers for vehicle electrification. And particularly, again, looking at it from the energy side. And some of these will ring true from what has just been said. I won't go through all of them, but the one thing you can say is law and regulation can be an enabler. It can also be a blocker, and the threat of law and regulation can also be an enabler, and we've seen that with climate change legislation, zones, and the Automated Electric Vehicles Act. What the study did show was that the main blockers here were around the user analysis. Again, choice and supply of vehicles. We're seeing that at the moment with fleet vehicles for electric vehicles. There's a lot of people who want to acquire them, but the vehicles are not there yet, and the production is being slowed down as far as we can see. Cost is a big blocker for mass EV take-up at the moment, and the government can do something about that. And the way in which government can also do something is around charging, and we've heard that from our first speaker today. The big blockers for everyone still remain charger anxiety and range anxiety. So where are those charge points? Can we connect with them even if we turn up at those charge points? How long is it going to take to charge? And charging, of course, is a big issue for electric vehicles and one we're all going to have to face up to. So I've not touched on all of those, but one of the things I do want to touch on, which is quite close to my heart, is how we're going to fit electric vehicles into and this electric vehicle revolution. And it will be a revolution. It's incredible what's going to happen and what will happen over the course of the next few years, into what has been an energy revolution as well, in case you didn't realize over the last 10 years. What's happened in energy is quite astonishing. I keep telling my young lawyers when I do talks on this, they don't realize what they've just lived through and are living through in terms of an energy revolution. We have moved from the energy side to new clean generation, but we're still going to need more of that. We have moved much more from a transmission, spine-connected system of energy right down to local distributed level, which has caused all sorts of issues as well. So we've ended up with a system of transmission and connection which is under stress, is probably not suitable for the purpose at the moment, and which we're now trying to patch up with what we now call flexible mechanisms and flexible generation and flexible solutions. And also at the same time, which I think has been interesting from my perspective, is the growth over the last 10 years of corporates actually getting to grips with energy as well. There was the wave, of course, of environmental consciousness amongst corporates, and it's now moved into renewable energy and the fact that a corporate now needs to be demonstrating that it procures its electricity supplies from green energy. Electric vehicles will be a key part of that going forward, and already you're seeing that coming through. So the good news on all of this is that electric vehicles have a big role to play in all of these and can actually help with some of these system stresses and so forth. So there is a natural fit there. But have we got a seamless policy context? Earlier this morning at one of the breakfast sessions, we had a talk, and one of those was around does energy and the policy of energy and actually sit with what we're trying to achieve with electric vehicles. So you have things like the industrial strategy, you have the clean growth policy, all of which is very much promoting electric vehicles. And yet it sits alongside energy policy and planning policy, which maybe doesn't quite do what it needs to do. On the planning side, for example, there are still major restrictions on new build renewable generation. The reason being that the government believes it has enough at the moment to hit its targets on energy generation, but does it have enough to hit its targets or provide the needs for electric vehicles going forward? At what point are we going to have to open up again to look at onshore renewables? We've got an energy policy that needs energy storage, and electric vehicles can provide a solution to that, and we need batteries and battery storage. And yet at every turn at the moment we're having reviews under policies from grid, Ofgem, government, which is ratcheting back effectively the money that can be made from electricity storage to such an extent that major large-scale storage is almost not viable at the moment unless you are a huge utility. So there is a conflict there, and it needs to be sorted out. So I'm going to end with some observations which hopefully we can pick up in some questions. I think to solve the conflicting policy that I've just talked about, obviously we had the announcement of the EV Energy Task Force, which I welcome, and it could be very good, but we'll wait and see. This idea of leaving the electric vehicle network, upgrades, transmission to the private sector and charging to the private sector, is that the right approach? Well, possibly it is, but with all of those things, you need to be very careful because that private sector needs to come on in, and you need to have parameters around which that investment takes place, and you need to set the goals as to what you're actually looking for. Otherwise, you won't get the standardization that you need at an early stage. Charging infrastructure needs to be properly future-proofed. So the act that I talked about earlier on may help with that, but I can tell you early on what we've seen in charging infrastructure is a lot of charging infrastructure going in which might prove to be completely redundant in a few years' time, which may not work in a few years' time, and which has been facilitated by grants that are out there which are welcome. But is it the right infrastructure, and is it what people need going forward and longer term? There's also been a grab by the private sector for sites and for grid connections and sites where chargers can be put, and there's surely going to be a consolidation there, and some of those sites must surely prove to be redundant as well. There needs to be a massive change, I think, in the grid mindset and our transmission and distribution system. I talked about the stresses on the electricity system. With EVs connecting in, home charging and so forth, from the energy side, the policy from government is we need to sweat these assets, make the most of our grid connection infrastructure that's already there. But going forward, is that the right thing to do to future-proof our network? Should we not be thinking about investment and upgrades on a material scale? And who's going to pay for that? It's not an easy question, I understand, but it is difficult. Incentives that people can trust. So we've seen this particularly in the renewables industry, that incentives were there and then they get withdrawn to such an extent that people now start to distrust when incentives are brought in. How long will they last? When will my vehicle grant run out? When will it get ratcheted back? We need incentives at an early stage. Incentives, however, carry risk. They carry the risk that government can change them and people become reliant on incentives. So that balance is very key. And lastly, we're talking about EVs today and everyone looking at EV ownership and EV charging. But are we looking future in 20 years' time? How many EVs will we need? How will transport work? How will people get transported around? And I think at the moment there's a lot of people looking over the course of the next 10, 20 years. But beyond that, actually, is some of what we'll be doing today in terms of infrastructure for EVs, again, going to be redundant in 20 years' time when transport will have changed again with connected autonomous vehicles and so forth. So that all sounds a bit miserable, but I'm incredibly enthused by electric vehicles and what they can do, and particularly what they can do to the mindset from a clean growth plan and from an emissions plan for the general public. Because if we can get this right, and if we can get EVs out there and people realizing that electric vehicles work, that they're useful, that they ratchet down emissions, and there's an element of home charging attached to them, it will engage people once again, just like actually the small-scale renewables did and solar did for those skeptics, in energy and where energy comes from, and particularly getting their energy, managing their energy properly and how it can be utilized. So there's a fantastic opportunity here. It will be a revolution and it's very exciting, but we do have some big challenges. Thanks.